Hello and welcome. My name is Fabio Gigi. I'm the chair of the Japan Research Center here at SOAS. And it's a great pleasure to be chairing this last event of the year. If you remember, last year we had Joseph Kiburtz from the Collège de France come and give a talk about the Ise Taima. So we always have sort of a slightly more liturgical, perhaps, more ritual topic just before the winter break. And today is no exception. I'm very happy to be welcoming Dr. Abigail Macbain, who is a lecturer in pre-modern Japanese history at the University of Edinburgh, one of the last sort of named posts with a very specific purview. So we're very happy to have you here at the JRC to give a talk. She graduated from Columbia in 2021 and joined Edinburgh last year. Is that correct?
2022.
2022, after a year's postdoc. And she will be talking to us today about performing cultures, multicultural music and dance in 8th century Japan, focusing on the Kaigan Kuyo, the great eye-opening ceremony of the great Buddha at Tōdaiji. So welcome also to our guests online. We have a very illustrious, as I've just saw to my own surprise, a list of attendants online from Ed Cammons to Fabio Rambelli. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak at SOAS. What I don't think anybody in this room knows is I applied to SOAS for my master's and then decided to go to Canada instead because they gave me a full ride, and that is exceptionally rare. They don't do that anymore, I don't think. Well, maybe they do. Anyway, but I didn't tell anybody here. I just kind of ghosted SOAS until I got an email or a package saying, we're so excited to see you in about a month's time, and figured, oh, I better send an email. So this is my 20-year late arrival to SOAS. Apologies to the administrators for that very late work 20-some years ago. So today I'm talking about, this is research that I did as part of my PhD thesis, and I've continued to do a little bit more work on it because it's just such an incredibly fun topic. I did change the title slightly. The only reason for this is because I gave a talk related to this topic a few weeks ago, and I wanted to freshen it up and give you something more bespoke. But there is some overlap with that, but fresh PowerPoint, slightly different title, and more of a focus of looking at the theme of performing arts and how they open up a view on the outside world. And I am a Buddhist historian or a religious historian, and so that is very much my angle of looking at part of the appeal of Buddhism in the 8th century is its very international presence, and that in the process of Buddhism being transmitted to Japan, it's also bringing with it an exceptionally rich material culture along with it, and that this is part of its appeal, is that Buddhist ceremony at this time engages every single one of the senses, and they have to be engaged to provide the proper mindset, but also the sense of it being an experience. So today I'm going to be looking at the multicultural dances that took place after the Kaigen Kuyo in the 8th century. Now I need to first explain what the Kaigen Kuyo, or eye-opening ceremony, is to better explain how this setting set up the multicultural dances that followed. So a Kaigen Kuyo in general, or eye-opening ceremony in general, this is the process of completing a Buddhist statue. It is typically the last stage. And in Japanese history, or art history at least, process of making a statue changed in the Kamakura period, where you went from painting in the pupils of the statue to instead creating crystal eyes. rock crystal, there we go, with colored paper behind it, and to give an exceptionally realistic presence of these Buddha statues. But that's in the Kamakura period. We're not going to see that for hundreds of years. By this point, we're still seeing what was being done in the rest of Asia, including in India, of the process of awakening these statues and transforming it from a statue to an icon. So in the process of painting in this pupil, this is now opening the statue and allowing the presence of that Buddha or Bodhisattva to enter in. Now you are in the presence of, in this case, Vairocana Buddha. So the specific eye-opening ceremony happened at Tōdaiji Temple happened in 752. This is an exceptionally auspicious date. First of all, the 9th day of the 4th month is one day after the birthday of the historical Buddha. And one record suggests that it was actually supposed to take place on the 8th, which was the day of the historical Buddha's birthday. We don't know why it didn't happen. Maybe bad weather. Maybe they didn't want to overlap. But the timing of that specific date is important. But also 752 is very, very important because according to the first court record, the Nihon Shoki, this is 200 years exactly after Buddhism's official introduction to Japan from Korea. So in order to fit this very auspicious timing, the statue was nowhere near complete. It had been cast over a period of 3 years with brand new casting technology invented just for this 15-meter, roughly 50-foot statue. Nowhere else in Asia had this kind of bronze casting technology because Japan didn't even have this casting technology until this point. So in order to make this Buddha, it was basically, there were 8 stages of pouring bronze into cast and then building a mountain essentially around this and then pouring the bronze in. So it wasn't until the statue was completed and that mountain could be pulled away that we could even see if this brand new casting technology had worked or not. But bronze casting is not a perfect process, especially when you're inventing something fairly new. There would be gaps, there would be rough spots. The intended plan was to cover the entire statue with gilding. And gold had only just been found in Mutsu province a little while before this. So probably the face has been gilded, but the rest of the statue is probably pretty rough. And then Tōdaiji itself was nowhere near completed. Tōdaiji had a very long history going back to Emperor Shomu building a mausoleum for his first child and then building another temple for his second child. This area had a very close relationship to the ruler who called for this great Buddha to be built, Emperor Shomu, very close tie to his family. But when he decided to create this huge temple complex, it has to be built around this massive statue that is still in the process of being created. So when this ceremony takes place, it is absolutely amazing with banners of all different colors, with musicians everywhere. It is an incredible spectacle in the middle of a construction site. So we have to take into mind that kind of perception of what this is. Now, oh, and this is a picture of the cleaning process to give you an understanding of just how large this statue's face is, but also what it would have been like for the priest who filled in those pupils. So in looking at the music that was performed, and I apologize if the red in particular is a little too dark, I'll try to read that out. We see 2 different categories depending upon which source is recording the pieces that were being performed after the ceremony. So after the ceremony, everybody processes out into the courtyard before the Buddha, before the main Buddha hall, and that is where the dances take place. We have clear pieces, roughly either 5 or 6 pieces or 5 or 6 categories. It's not always clear whether one category had multiple pieces of what I'm referring to as just wagaku, which is the Japanese courtly music. Now, this is not entirely Japanese created courtly music. Some of this is coming from China. We'll see one piece in particular came from China in the 7th century, and that was the polka. But it's also pieces that are of Japanese derivation, but it's based upon a Chinese type of courtly dance that in China it's called yayue. In Japanese, that's called gagaku, except it's not actually the same thing. The Japanese court didn't like the yayue, probably because it's very, very tied to imperial justifications in a very Confucian mandate of heaven sort of sense. Instead, the Japanese court really loved yanyue, which was the banquet music that the Japanese bureaucrats and monks were seeing when they would go to the Tang capital of Chang'an. And this is what they're reporting back. So they have the characters for the courtly music of yayue, but the actual types of music that's being performed is more like yanyue, the banquet, the fun music. So that's one category of music that we have. Things that have a very clear tie to early Japanese culture and court, or that were introduced from China very early on. And then the second category is the bangaku, overseas music, or if we want to be a little bit more literal, the barbarian music. This category to me is really fascinating because while the names of the wagaku reflect the types of steps that were done in that dance, or the costumes or props, or which specific family typically performed that dance, that is not the case with the bangaku. Instead, with that, they're being named after the country of origin. These are the Chinese pieces. These are the Korean pieces. These are the pieces from Southeast Asia, which seems like a very logical way to categorize these pieces. But that is so simplistic and does not take into consideration how these pieces developed on the Asian continent itself before coming to Japan. There were so many years of transmission and development. And when we look at Tang period history, there's this absolute fascination with outside groups, and especially nomadic tribes, the Sogdians in particular, that what the Japanese bureaucrats are observing and what is being brought over to Japan is so much richer than just saying, oh, it's Tang music. Oh, it's Korean music, because what is Korean music? What is Chinese music, except for this wonderful blending and mixing of all of these different performances that are what consists of pop music. So, sorry, kind of went ahead to my next point. When I talk to my students about that, I tell them to think of what is pop music today. And it would be hard to say that American pop music or British pop music is only based upon what is created here and not take into consideration, for example, K-pop or artists from other countries. And that's very much what we see what's happening in China and Korea and also Japan. But that's not necessarily well known by the Japanese court, and certainly not by the chroniclers, who are just going based on, we'll just say these are all the ones coming from China. So that's part of my main argument here, is that these overseas musical entertainment, they're bringing over more aspects of foreign culture than just what their titles indicate. And this Gigaku mask, I'll come back to Gigaku in a little bit, but this kind of foreshadows a little bit of how these types of musical performance provide insight into the outside world for a court that is not very engaged in external trade or travel. So the way that I do this is to place textual passages alongside remaining artifacts, and then also contextualize them in relation to what's happening in China at this time. Another point that I want to argue is that this is part of this broader Buddhist cosmology, and that's not just about rituals and texts. That part of the appeal of Buddhism is it has a full-blown cosmology. It has a sense of structure, of geography, of continents. And so part of my argument is that Buddhism provided a means for the early Japanese court to understand other countries and where they were geographically situated, and where Japan itself was also geographically situated in relation to them. So I'm very lucky in that the city of Nara has really embraced its history with these wonderful performances. And so they, up until this past year, sadly, but for about the past 10 years, there were annual performances trying to recreate and give a sense of what these performances might look like. So I want to play a quick clip. This is on YouTube. The Heijo Heijokyo actually has quite a few of these clips up if you would like to see different angles. But this gives you just a tiny glimpse of what this might have looked and felt like. Only imagine it on a much, much broader scale. Okay, so now I should note this was not trying to recreate the eye-opening ceremony itself. This was actually trying to give a sense of 7th century rather than 8th century performance. But nonetheless, we do get a little bit of a sense of the type of spectacle that would be associated with this kind of procession. So I want to provide a little bit more context here. I realize that we're mostly Japan scholars, but for anybody who is not or who does not really touch pre-modern on a regular basis, just to give us a sense of setting. So we are looking at Tōdaiji Temple in the early 8th century capital of Nara, which is located very close to Osaka and Kyoto. Now, I think most people who have been to Japan and who have been to Nara are very, very familiar with this building right here, which is the Tōdaiji Buddha Hall. However, it had a nasty habit of burning down during wartime. So this is actually the third iteration of the temple hall. And it's about, I think, a third smaller than the original. So to understand what the original looks like, not sure what happened up there. We can see here that in the 20s, somebody very nice, kindly built smaller models of what the previous versions of the temples, both the 8th century and the subsequent rebuildings later on. Now, what's notable to me is, first of all, we have a much larger Buddha hall, as I mentioned, but we also have these two pagodas on either side. This is very reflective of a Korean style, namely from Paekje, of building temples, where you have this dual pagoda symmetrically placed in relation to the Buddha hall. And just trying to relate the 8th century Tōdaiji location with modern day Tōdaiji terrain. This is the best I could find, this map from 1969. So we see in the blue square there, that's where the Buddha Hall is. Those green squares, that's where those two pagodas were. Now, again, this wasn't completely built by the time of the eye-opening ceremony. I don't know how far along it necessarily was or if the pagodas had been built yet or not. But nonetheless, we can see that it was conceived as being an absolutely enormous temple complex at this time. Now, another notable building is at the very top of the screen in the orange box. That is the Shosoin. And the Shosoin deserves special recognition, especially for anybody who is interested in Silk Road art and transmission. Along with the Dunhuang caves, especially the library cave, the Shosoin is an enormous repository of 8th century materials from all over East Asia and Central Asia and South Asia. So we're also very, very lucky that the Shosoin, this is an 8th century building made entirely of wood that never burned down. This is exceptionally rare in Japan. And so while the materials have been brought out, the building itself still does stand. This is an old style of building based upon a granary, which was meant to keep insects and vermin, but also moisture out. So that's why the items that were stored in there have been exceptionally well preserved. This is, again, an absolutely enormous resource. Of the items that have been cataloged, we have about 9,000. And again, we have pieces that have not been cataloged. Just text alone, we have somewhere around 10,000. So I don't know what amount of that 9,000 and what amount of that 10,000 overlap, but suffice it to say, this is huge. And for those who like to use artistic materials, I've put this QR code up here because there's links to the Shosoin website where you can actually do searches, and they've put very good quality images up of a huge number of the treasures and some of the texts as well that have been well cataloged. The Nara National Museum also holds special exhibits every autumn dedicated to a portion of the pieces from the Shosoin. Okay. Now, before delving into the actual musical performances, I'd like to give a sense of the overview of the ceremony itself, at least in terms of the international elements, because this was highly international. And this actually was a key topic of my PhD thesis, were these overseas monks who had arrived at the same time in the mid-8th century. So first of all, and perhaps most importantly, we have Bodhisena, an Indian Brahmin monk. He was also the superintendent or soljo of the Ministry for Monastic Affairs. This means that the #1 monk in charge of all of the monks and nuns in Japan is an Indian Brahmin, according to records. Of course, we don't really know for sure, but he is also credited with introducing some of the Sanskrit liturgical music that was performed, probably already had some version of this Sanskrit liturgical music known as bonbai or shomyo later on. It's thought that it was probably more Korean based, whereas after Bodhisena or possibly beforehand, we start to see actual Sanskrit being used within a Buddhist ceremony. We have Daoshuan, who is also part of the eye-opening ceremony, and he was the preceptor, meaning that he was in charge of actually performing the ordinations until the very famous Ganjin arrives a few years later. But he also gave a lecture or sermon on the Flower Garland Sutra. And the Flower Garland Sutra is very, very closely tied to Tōdaiji. And as I'm going to talk about at the end of the talk, we also see very, very close ties between the Buddhist cosmology that is very popular throughout East Asia at this time and the Flower Garland Sutra. There's also Butatsu, and I've used his Japanese pronunciation because we just don't know very much about him. Records say that he and Bodhisena were close friends, or at least arrived in Japan together and maybe arrived in China together. He's recorded as coming from Rinyu in Japanese, which is sometimes translated as Champa, but it seems to really be a small Vietnamese kingdom called Lamap that later on becomes part of Champa in modern day Vietnam. So he might be Vietnamese, in which case his name would probably be something like Phot Chiet. He might also be Indian, and Indian scholarship tends to embrace him. And part of the reason for that is because the pieces that he is credited with introducing this Southeast Asian Nin-Yugaku actually seem to be Indian in origin, or at least in themes. So if he's Indian, then his name would probably be something like Buddhist. To me, I don't think it's actually important to know for sure or to pick a side, because I think at this time, it's more important that we embrace the ambiguity of what was known about other countries. And especially if we're talking about Southeast Asia, what's another term for Southeast Asia but Indochina? This very, very close relationship between India and China at this time. So even if these pieces are reflecting Indian influence, that does not mean that they were not performed or created in Southeast Asia, or that he himself is not Southeast Asian who went to India and learned these pieces and brought them in. There are also theories that he does not exist at all. So we have this character Butetsu, who's very intriguing. We know very little about. I've seen a couple of records that say that he performed in the eye-opening ceremony, but the big sources that I rely on, he has disappeared from them by that time and possibly died. So I just added this in because I originally took out this slide, but to show how we can use pieces from the Shosoin to help contextualize what the texts themselves are telling us. This is a passage from the Tōdaiji Oroku about Bodhisena, the Indian Brahmin monk, taking a brush and painting in the eyes of the statue. And that in order that the other people who are observing this ceremony could also take place in this incredibly important event and therefore benefit from the karma also being produced from this action, that there is a long cord attached to it and everybody held on to that cord. Now, according to the Shosoin records, the brush at the very top right of the screen was used in at least an eye-opening ceremony. I don't know if it's the eye-opening ceremony because there were multiple when there were repairs that had to be made on the Great Buddha. And then below, we see this blue silk cord, and the records also say that this was the cord that was used. And it very well may have been, actually, because so many of the items in the Shosoin date back to the 8th century. But at the very least, this gives us incredible insight into what these pieces may have looked like at this time. So turning to the texts themselves, there are two main texts that depict the eye-opening ceremony. The first is the Shoko Nihongi, which is a court record of the events and happenings at court. It doesn't contain some references to Bodhisena and to Daoshuan as well, but it's mostly focused on happenings of the court, not so much happenings at temples. So just to read quickly, meanwhile, musicians from the Ministry of Courtly Music, the Gakkaku-ryo, and various temples all gathered together. Then imperial retainers and various kinship groups carried out music and dance, such as the gosechi, the kumemai, the tatafushi, the toka, and the hoko. Voices carried out from east to west, and musicians divided and walked into the garden. It was a thing so miraculously resplendent that it exceeds the ability to be recorded. Since the time that Buddhist law came eastward to Japan, such a celebration had never before been held. So it's mostly looking at just the splendor. This was a really great party. This was amazing. This was beautiful, resplendent. But when it comes to the music and dance, it's entirely focused on pieces that the courtier would recognize, pieces that were performed at court itself. There really isn't any insight here into other pieces from other parts of the world. So to me, this is just reflecting the knowledge and the bias of the chronicler. By comparison, the Tōdaiji Oroku, these are the records, the essential records of Tōdaiji Temple. There are multiple accounts related to the eye-opening ceremony. But there's one from the section that was added. It was one of the last additions to the Tōdaiji Oroku from 1241. My theory is that this was copied down because it was brought in from another temple's collections. This, I can only put a small passage up because it is an enormous section. So here we see the part I want to focus on is the eye-opening has just happened and the other ceremonies have just completed. Thereupon, monks from the 4 temples of Dayanji, Yakushiji, Gangoji, and Kofukuji presented various marvelous gifts. Then from the eastern side of the pillar by the south gates, a variety of tumultuous types of music played. Monks from the 4 major temples proceeded out of the temple and circled the space twice, while accompanied by toragaku music. They divided into 2 lines and stood in front of the hall. So we see multiple pieces of information here. One historian, Yoshikawa Shinji, his theory is that this reference to the various marvelous gifts actually refers to the music that was accompanied, and that what these temples were actually providing were the musical instruments and the costumes so that Tōdaiji itself could have its own performing arts troupe. These major temples actually had their own performing art troupes, all connected with overseas forms of music. They all specialized in a different kind of overseas music. And so perhaps in providing these gifts, they were providing the means for Tōdaiji to have their own performing art troupe to be able to hold their own ceremonies in the future. Smaller temples were reliant upon the ministry for courtly music, the Gagaku-ryo. So in this sense, they're helping them be independent. This mention of toragaku is very interesting too. We don't know what toragaku is. The usual theory is that it's from Jeju Island off the coast of Korea. There are also theories that it's from India or Indonesia. We don't know. We can find a little bit more information from some artifacts left in the Shosoin, but really we don't know. Now, when I say I can't give you the full passage, it's because the Tōdaiji Yoroku has this incredibly detailed list of the performances that took place after everybody processed out of the temple. So there were the processions. Each of the different types of music and dance were listed, and they were led out by 2 courtiers. Notably, a lot of courtiers connected with music and foreigners and Buddhists, the Buddhist community. So when we look at this list, this is in order of how it appears in the Tōdaiji Yoroku. The very top ones, if you look at the second to last column, where I have listed if it's from court or continent, we see the courtly ones came first. And these pretty much all correspond with what was said in the Shoko Nihongi. There is one exception that is not listed here, and that is the hoko, but I will come back to that later. So when we look at this list of pieces, we can see that the names and the countries that are associated with them just based upon the titles, but they're very simplistic. Again, it's just saying, oh, this is a type of music that came from early Tang. This is a type of music that came from mid-Tang. This is a type of music that came from Korea. This is a type of music that came from Korea with women. Sometimes we see things about the performers, especially the courtly music, where we have specific clans that are being identified as performing them. One that I find very interesting is the Toka number 4. I mentioned this before. This is a courtly dance that was introduced from China in the 7th century. Now, saying that it's women from the Aya clan, the Aya have been in Japan for multiple generations, but they still maintained a very close association as coming from China. So perhaps these women from the Aya family were specifically picked because of this Chinese connection. It could have been coincidental. It could have been for another reason. I don't know. But there's a possibility that this continental origin story that stayed so much a part of the Aya identity may have been part of the reason why they're assigned to it. Another one that I will talk about in more detail is number 11, the Tonyomai. I'm not positive about the romanization. It could be Tojomai or To-onamai. I just feel like Tonyomai rolls off the tongue better. But this one really struck my interest because it's one dance and it specifically refers to the costume. It's 20 women in hakama, which are a type of trouser. And again, I will come back to that later, but I find that very interesting, especially when we're trying to put that in relation to what hakama remain in the shosoin, but also what hakama might mean in China. So what can we, what can we take away from these pieces? First of all, a number of these pieces, like I said before, have these overseas origins where we can tell from the names where they are coming from. Namely China, Korea, Southeast Asia. Gigaku, I will get into a little bit later. Mixed origins as best we can tell. But also we see heavy presence of women dancers and women musicians. Now this is reflecting both courtly standards and practices as well as introduced dances as well, where this presence of women is very strong, very, very notable. Now, many of the courtly dances, like the gosechimai and the toka, these are known for having women dancers, like the gosechimai in particular has women dancers in it. That's a core part of the gosechimai. And the o utame literally says chorus of women with accompanying dances. The character for woman is right there in there. So on the one hand, we could think of this as maybe being an avenue for women to be part of a very male-dominated ceremony. On the other hand, it may just reflect that women have a very strong presence in performing arts at this time. In fact, either by this time or within about 8 years, we see the development of a government bureau dedicated to women performers in Nara, Japan. And the reason I say we're not sure is we have two records saying two different things. Now, overseas dances, again, we're seeing a lot of references to women performers. And this is reflecting what's happening in China as well. We also see some of that, we're really not sure. The hoko, this was mentioned in the Shoko Nihongi version. This does not seem to be a dance at all. As far as I can tell, I can't find anything on the hoko dance. Instead, it seems to be referring to robe and trousers, which is the standard dress for a bureaucrat at this time. There's also one that I've translated tobukona, but we really don't know how to translate this, and I can't find other romanization. I have no idea what this means. Directly, it's jump child name. It's probably something where the character, the sound of the character corresponds with what the name would have been from this continental dance. Another theory I have is that there were some very popular dances, exceptionally popular dances in the Tang that involved twirling and jumping. The most notable one is the Sogdian whirl. This was incredibly popular. So quite possibly this may be referring to the Sogdian whirl. Don't know, but embrace the ambiguity. And that also means that we can embrace other possibilities rather than just glossing over it. Now, at the risk of sounding like I am part of a Blackadder sketch, I really want to emphasize this point and this reference with trousers. And I also have to say that as an American, I know I have to be very, very careful about my word choices, because if I'm talking about dancing women in pants, that might not get the right mental image that I want. So if I mess up, I apologize. But what I'm really talking about is the performing costume of these particular dances. And why I'm pointing to this specific mention of trousers is because both the Shoko Nihongi and the Tōdaiji Yoroku go out of their way to mention dances with trousers. And in the case of the Tōdaiji Yoroku, they were so specific of one dance performed by 20 women in hakama. And I have this picture here of a Japanese bureaucrat showing the hole and the kohl from the hoko and the Shoko Nihongi. So what do these references to trousers or hakama mean in a broader sense? And for this, we need to start looking at China and what musical entertainment looked like in Tang China. When I was talking about this with one of my coworkers, he mentioned the term performing exotica that I absolutely love. So what we see happening in popular forms of music that are not only in the Tang capitals, but spreading throughout the countryside is very much performing exotica. There are people coming from all over the Chinese sphere of influence, beyond just East Asia and South Asia, but also coming in from Central Asia. We have nomads and traders and just an absolute melting pot in these capital cities. Whether they're coming to provide tribute or to trade, they're bringing their performers with them. And they're performing at banquets where the bureaucrats and the courtiers are witnessing these different types of performing arts. And they're saying, this is what it means to be an empire. To be an empire in a Tang Chinese sense means not necessarily investing in pure Chinese culture, whatever that is. It means flourishing and really embracing the absolute diversity of performing arts and the different types of peoples that they have some degree of control over, or at least let's say influence. So the Japanese courtiers are seeing this, and this is what they're reporting back, that this is what it looks like in Chang'an, is you have all of these different peoples, all of these different performers. And we see also in China an absolute fascination with the nomadic tribes in particular and the Sogdians and what they're wearing and what their music sounds like. And so we see this development of the Huyue or barbarian music, as well as Hufu barbarian dress. And this becomes just standard Tang style dress and standard Tang style music is very, very much based upon what these other tribes, other groups are performing within the capitals. Excuse me. So this was something that I mentioned this very briefly to a graduate student when I was at Columbia. And she said, I wish I knew who she was. We only met the one time. She's like, oh, well, if they're wearing pants, because I was in the US at the time, that probably means that this is a nomadic influence because women in nomadic tribes wear a split skirt to ride horses. Now, not all of them do. The Sogdians, for example, and their style of trousers became very, very popular in Tang China. That's a male style of dress. But then male styles of dress were popular among women in Tang China as well. So, but nonetheless, perhaps what we're seeing here with the specific mention, and since we don't know what else could be said about this Tonyou Mai, these Chinese dances by women, perhaps it's that specific mention of hakama could be referring to a costume that was associated with a very specific dance. Again, I can't prove it, but we're embracing ambiguity here and possibilities. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this was a quote that my colleague translated from a work in German that really helps to give a sense of the extraordinary diversity of the Tang capitals. So I'll just read the parts in yellow. Thousands of Turks, Buddhist monks from India, Persian priests, Armenian merchants, Mongolian riders, Sogdian camel drivers, Tibetan princes, pilgrims from Japan, envoys from Bali, Koreans, Uyghurs, and Jews, even Christians from the Mediterranean came together in the metropolis. On the streets, foreign acrobats and jugglers performed. All of Chang'an, even the court, reveled in the allure of foreign exotica. Uyghur hair knots, Central Asian makeup, Iranian vests, and leopard skin hats were all the rage. So again, this is what the Japanese courtiers are seeing. These are what the Japanese monks are seeing. And to them, this is what being an international, cosmopolitan, globally connected Buddhist nation is. It's embracing the outside world and demonstrating your access and knowledge and awareness of these other forms of performing arts. We have wonderful insights from cave paintings as well as grave goods of how this Hufu, the barbarian or nomadic tribe dress really influenced the the dress of everybody, but especially performers. We also see here two different types of trousers in the figurine. The female attendant wearing trousers from the tomb. These are a baggier style trouser, perhaps more typical of what I would imagine from a Tang period dress. On the left, this is a little hard to see. I've tried to lighten it up, but this is coming from Mogao Cave 220. And we see two dancers wearing very, very tight leggings and maybe more of an Indian style. Mogao Cave 220 is actually a really fascinating cave because it's bringing together very important Buddhist stories with music and dance as well. There's this combination between the two all over the walls. It's really fascinating to see. Now, what did the hakama look like? Again, I'm making a lot out of one very small passage, but the shosōin can help me with this because there are specific hakama in the collection that have been identified as being worn during the eye-opening ceremony performances. So on the left here, we have hakama used in toragaku, and specifically the toragaku kyuta. We also see socks referencing being used in toragaku body dances. So this gives us names of specific toragaku dances. Toragaku is the one that I mentioned. We don't know where it comes from, but it's thought to probably come from Jeju. Now to me, this very much looks almost like a bloomers or breeches style of hakama. On the right-hand side, we have a very different kind of hakama. And notably, this one is identified as being a woman-style hakama that was worn for Tosangaku. Now, Tosangaku is an acrobatic performance. Later on in Japan, this becomes Sarugaku. But this is the origins of this. Very, very acrobatic. I'll show you an image in a moment to give a sense of what that looks like. So perhaps this is what the hakama looked like. And this actually connects to a very, very early style of pre-Tang, it's hard to call them even trousers that were used in China where they basically come up to the knee and then have a form of braces holding them up. An amazing source that we have of what these costumes and hats would have looked like is with the dankyu bow. Now the dankyu has no connection to the Tōdaiji eye-opening, but it is an 8th century ceremonial bow that is in the shosōin. So it's time appropriate. On the underside of this bow is completely coated with these ink drawings of performers and acrobats. This is what the acrobats would have looked like. Also, a lot of musicians and wrestlers. And if we look on the right, you can actually see some of that style of hakama where it's just coming up over the leg. So I don't know, maybe this is what those 20 women doing the tonyomai were wearing. Or maybe the passage was wrong. Maybe it wasn't for the tonyomai. Maybe it was for the tosangaku. We always have to be open to the possibility of our sources have a transcription error. But nonetheless, we do see this connection. And some of these performers look like women to me with how their hair is being held up or how their robes are gathered. So I'm going to try to go quickly through this last bit. What we also have to consider is in as much as these dances can tell us about other parts of the world and insights beyond what their names might tell us, we also have to pull back from what it tells us and second guess whether or not that's really the case. Because this is a world before world maps. This is a country that is not known for having explorers. So even though there are records that talk about Linyu, Southeast Asia, there's nobody who's ever been to it. So when they say, oh, this is in the northern Tenjiku part, well, how does that relate to South Tenjiku or Central Tenjiku? There's not always a really clear sense that they know what they're talking about with this. So we have to second guess what they actually know when they're recording where these pieces of music are coming from. So when we look at the Ninyu gaku, the music purportedly coming from modern day Vietnam, there's some question about that. I already mentioned some of the uncertainties around the monk Butatsu, who is typically credited with introducing these pieces of Ringyugaku. Now, in the Tōdaiji Yoroku, it states that there were 3 pieces that were performed at the Tōdaiji Eye opening. There are actually 8 pieces of Ringyugaku that are part of the Japanese Gagaku repertoire. And those continue to be performed today. One of them is known to be Japanese origin. The others, though, have very Indian sounding names or themes within the pieces of music. So that's led some modern scholars to refer to these not as Ringyugaku, but rather as Tenjikugaku, referring to an old name for India. But again, there's so much transmission and movement that we really don't know where this is coming from, where it's going to, how it's being transmitted. And frankly, it could have been in Japan well before this period because this type of Southeast Asian music was already part of Chinese repertoire. So this could have already been transmitted over. Also, there has to be a certain element of translation with any of these pieces. Different modes, different tempos, different instruments, not having the right knowledge of the dances. There's an interpretation with all of this. And if it's coming into Japan via China, then it's a Japanese interpretation of a Chinese interpretation of a Southeast or possibly Indian style of music and dance. So just because it says it's from Southeast Asia in its title doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case. I'm not sure if I have enough time to go into Gigaku to the extent that I would love to. It's okay? All right. So another type of dance that we see performed at the eye opening ceremony, and this was actually very popular in the 7th century, basically from the 7th century until about the 12th century, this type of performance was held in Japan. And I like to refer to this as Japanese panto because it's very comedic. There are masks that have caricatures to them. And if we actually break this down and look at it, it's this absolute pastiche of different influences and characters from multiple different countries. More than any of these dances, it's Gigaku that really demonstrates the degree to which Japan had, or that one of these dances could pull together different cultural influences. Now, according to the Nihon Shoki, Gigaku was introduced by a Korean performer named Mimaji or Mimashi. However, it's been pointed out too that that's not a particularly Korean name. Instead, it might actually be a Buddhist title from Central Asia, maybe around Tibet, as what I've seen one scholar suggest. We don't know. There are 2 sets of characters that are used for Gigaku. The first translates to skilled or technique music, and the second is music from the state of Wu. And that makes, frankly, more sense given some of the characters that are in Gigaku plays. Now, the state of Wu, this is from the Warring States period. It's been hundreds of years since the Warring States period. There is no state of Wu that we know of with that character in Tang, China. So already we're dealing with a kind of pseudo-mythical state at this time, or potentially a part of China that we haven't uncovered in a text yet. But it's just absolutely combining together these different motifs from not just China, but also Central Asia and South Asia as well. And when we look at these masks and records of what was performed with this Gigaku, we're seeing these cultural stereotypes being brought along because Japan has no direct access to the countries and the peoples who are being reflected in these masks. And so what's being brought along is like, here's what a Sogdian king looks like. He's a drunkard. He wears a mask. He's got a curly Q mustache. So this stereotype is what is transmitted. We see masks of Brahmins. I'll show you in a minute what that would look like. Being introduced to Japan a century before they get an actual Brahmin monk coming to them in the form of Bodhisena. And we actually have hundreds of these masks. The Shosoin has something like 100 to 200 of these. And Horyuji Temple, which notably is not mentioned in either of the records as having participated, but we know from the number of Gigaku masks that they probably were. but they also have hundreds of masks that are left behind from the 7th and 8th century, and many of them are now in the Tokyo National Museum. So if we look at them, on the left here, we have a representation of the Suiko, the drunkard Sogdian king. Again, this looks almost like an old cartoon with a giant nose and the curly Q mustache. Very often he has a peaked hat as well. And then with the Brahmin on the right, we have wrinkled face, again, a gigantic nose and huge earlobes. Now, the ones that are most interesting to me, it's actually this one right here. This is Konron, named from the Kunlun Mountains. Now, the Kunlun Mountains are kind of more in the central and south of China, but that actual geographic location means nothing when it comes to these references to the Kunlun. The term Kunlun is just meant others, people who are racially other. Specifically in the Tang period, referring to people with wavy hair and dark skin from the Pacific, namely from around like the Philippines and Indonesia. And many of these people referred to as Kunlun were brought into China as slaves. And they were popular subjects in Tang period literature, even with them having magical powers or sexual prowess, special wisdom. So that is the mentality within which we see this Kunrun character being developed in a very demonic style look with these bat-like ears. And the Kunlun masks are always black or red and kind of bulbous. The character on the right here, this is a Kongo Rikishi, which is anybody who's been to a temple in East Asia is probably familiar with the Kongo Rikishi because they're very commonly portrayed in large temple gates. These are protectors, very, very muscular and with ferocious scowls, often holding a spear or what kind of looks almost like a baby rattle, but is a vajra. So these are Buddhist protectors. Now, in a 13th century depiction of the sketch involving Konron and the Kongo Rikishi, the sketch says that the Konron are harassing these maidens from Wu. Again, this is from the state of Wu, purportedly. And the way that they're harassing them is with enormous wooden phalluses. And then the Kongo Rikishi come in and rip the phalluses off and then swing them around them as part of their dance. And this is why I tell students that studying religion is never boring. So now, what does this story have to do with Buddhism, and why is it being portrayed within a Buddhist temple setting? We don't know, especially because Vinaya Buddhist precepts forbid monks and nuns from both participating in and observing this form of musical entertainment. And yet when we're looking at Buddhism in early Japan, this type of foreign performance is very much part of how Buddhism functioned. As I mentioned, the major temples had their own performing art troupes. So perhaps this is meant to show, you know, the triumph of Buddhism over the heathens, or maybe it's just meant to entertain. I know I'm a minute over, so I won't show it, but I do have a quick clip here. And if anybody wants to look up on YouTube, there is a clip of a modern day depiction of what Gigaku might have looked like.
We have some time. Wouldn't want to miss.
I mean, it doesn't have the Konron and the Kongo Rikishi. I'm not sure if that was like family friendly. But you can at least see some of these stereotypes being portrayed.
2002年、奈良東大寺の法要で再現された伎楽の様子です。実際の伎楽がどのようなものだったかは現在ではほとんど知られていません。ユーモラスな動きに仏教的な教訓を織り交ぜ、法要や貴賓のもてなしの場で演じられていました。
聖徳太子が法隆寺を建てたあたりの時代。
Okay. So you can see there the drunken king with a large like sake cup. that is not how Sogdians tend to portray themselves, let's say, in their own depictions. So the final point that I want to make is that I've been talking about how these performing arts introduced different aspects of global cultures and parts of the world that no Japanese had directly gone and observed for themselves. But this is also part of an emerging sense of a worldview and a very, very direct sense of how the world is laid out. So this is a world map. Technically, it's the replica of a world map that we see in Tōdaiji. If anybody's been to Tōdaiji, I'm curious if you recognize it or not, and I'll show you where it comes from. Those who know the Buddhist worldview, there is an axis mundi, a central pillar called Mount Sumeru. It's actually shaped kind of like an hourglass made of two pyramids, and then surrounded by rows of jagged mountains. I think the mountains are pretty easy to see, and then 4 continents around that, and then islands as well, and multiple seas. At the very, very bottom, you get a sense of a Buddha down there. Oh, so where do we see this? We see this at the base of the Tōdaiji. The dais that he is sitting on is it's a lotus flower, and each of those lotus petals has this depiction here. This is a line drawing that makes it a little bit easier to see. But this is reflecting the worldview in the Flower Garland Sutra, the layout of both a vertical and a horizontal understanding of how the world is put together. Now, I should note, these etched petals do not date to the time of the Lotus Sutra, but they date to about 2 years later. So it's very, very close in timing. And again, Tōdaiji itself is closely connected with the Flower Garland Sutra that has these depictions. So if we look more closely at this line drawing, we see Shakyamuni Buddha, who's the historical Buddha, in the middle, surrounded by bodhisattvas, that vertical layout of 33 heavens. And then at the bottom, you have multiple repeating and duplicating Mount Sumeru worldviews. And the sense of duplicating, immeasurability, reflecting upon itself is a key theme in the Flower Garland Sutra as well. So this is the type of worldview that's coming in just before the creation of the great Buddha. And so this is, again, part of the appeal of Buddhism at this time. It's actually closely connected with senses of world rulers. It's called Chakravartin within a Buddhist context. And we see China's Wu Zetian very much embracing this. Also in Korea, we see an embracing of the theme of the Chakravartin to the point where one Korean king even named his children after different types of Chakravartin rulers. And that's thought to be part of Emperor Shomu's purpose in creating Tōdaiji Temple, was to support his own regime, but his own world-conquering hopes and dreams that he himself could be this Buddhist world ruler at Chakravartin. All right, so going back to the 2 themes that I wanted to argue here was that the overseas musical entertainment brought over far more aspects of foreign culture and peoples than their titles themselves indicate. The titles, to me, reflect just the limited knowledge and perspective of the chroniclers, and they fail to account for the history of those dances' development in Asia. And then the dances themselves and the props and the costumes, including potentially the use of women in trousers, reflect certain geographical perspectives as well as racial and cultural stereotypes that are being transmitted as part of Japan's growing knowledge of the outside world. And that this is also part of a broader Buddhist cosmology. The global religion is part of its appeal, not just the text and the philosophies. The Mount Sumeru worldview gives a visual layout for other countries, including Japan. Then this is allowing the early Japanese court to perceive its own location relative to other countries and peoples. And that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let me quickly Okay, excellent. So let me stand over here. I have lots of questions, obviously, but I'll start us off with one. I mean, just connecting to the last bit. And people who joined us online, please feed your questions into the Q&A as we speak. So I was wondering, because there seems to be two different kinds of otherness that are presented. There are the actual visitors who come who are very exalted, high-ranking monks on one hand. So they are also part of the procession. So their otherness is presumably also on display. And then you have sort of their image that is sort of transmitted through the stereotype, the mask, and so on and so forth. And I wonder, I mean, how can we? This obviously, I totally get the point that this sort of is part of an emerging worldview, right? That there are other people, that they are not just, you know, over across the sea, but there's a world beyond that with people that we sort of we can read part of this otherness as an attempt to sort of decipher what these kinds of people could be. Is there, I don't know, well, this is more of a comment really, but what is the relationship between those two? You have the actual monks who are visibly foreign, presumably, and you have then the way that they are presented and maybe satirized a little bit.
Yes, I think very much satirized.
Right.
But do they know how much there is a satirization there? I think the otherness is a really important part of this. So the way that these monks came over, and if I ever finish it, I have what I've referred to as the article that will not die, that talks about the episode where two Japanese monks go to China to bring over a precepts master. This is a very well-known episode that ultimately ends with the monk Jianzhen or Ganjin coming over in 754. But before that happened, we have Bodhisena and Daoshuan and Butetsu coming. And according to the records about the time that they arrived, we also have an Iranian, potentially, at least he's recorded as being Iranian, and a few more Chinese people coming over. And it's not just these two monks who are inviting these people over. According to Bodhisena's biography, it is the Japanese ambassador who invites him to come. So to me, this is kind of a foreign skills, like a foreign talent search to bring foreign specialists to Japan, that there is an absolute interest in having them come. Now, I relate that more to interest in monastic ordinations than necessarily about influencing the culture. But it is, I think, clear to me at least that sense of foreignness is very important. We don't know what language these monks would have been speaking. They're all living together at Tōdaiji Temple. And to me, that's a great setup for a sitcom. But I'm thinking they're probably speaking Chinese. But they live out the rest of their lives in Japan. So I'm assuming they eventually learn Japanese. But like Bodhisena, we don't see him doing anything amazing other than being Indian to become the head of the Ministry for Monastic Affairs. So I think in that sense, that otherness is really important. And then when you have this pastiche, this almost kind of over the top, semi-satirical portrayal of other countries and peoples. And that actually happens to Bodhisena too, a little bit, not to the same degree later on, where he gets brought into Setsuwa with he and the Japanese monk Gyoki. And it's not necessarily the same over-the-top caricature, but the Indianness is actually quite important at being able to recognize the inner bodhisattva within Gyoki. And so that gets repeated in Setsuwa. And then when we see depictions of Bodhisena, especially in like, what are the two? There are two paintings. One is based on the other, but of the four saints of Tōdaiji. And it's Shomu, Gyoki, Bodhisena, and Ryoben, who is the first kind of head monk of Tōdaiji. But the way they portray Bodhisena, you can tell it's him automatically because he's got earrings, elongated robes. His robe is open, so you can see his chest. He has green eyes because that's kind of the tradition that has developed about him, is that he had green eyes. I haven't seen any textual references to him having green eyes, but it was important to portray that otherness and that foreignness later on, because how would you recognize him otherwise?
Thank you. That's fantastic. Right, I'll open up to the floor. Who wants to start this off? Yes, Mary, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I have two questions. First one is the girlfriend that's driving the imperial palace today. How closely related to that family at the Indian family? Is there notation in the shosoin? And second question is, shosoin has many objects used for the enlivening ceremony, as well as that everyone shows personal belongings that was donated by us. And there are so many instruments, musical instruments. Are those musical instruments related to the enlivening ceremony, or do you think they are more kind of music in the everyday life?
Oh, thank you. I'll repeat the questions for the online, and correct me if I leave anything out. So the first question is about the gagaku repertoire that's performed today in Japan, and how close is that to what is left in the shosoin in terms of notation. And then the second question is, within the shosoin, there are so many instruments, and it's true, it's an amazing collection. In fact, if you look at the search, you can pick just instruments. But several of these items in the shosoin are coming from Emperor Shomu, and some of them are from Tōdaiji Temple itself. So how many of these instruments that are left behind were used in the eye-opening ceremony, if any? Is that correct? Okay, so the first question, I have to remember it now, the notation. So not a great scholar on this. Lawrence Pickens actually has quite a lot of publications related to gagaku-ryo. His opinion is that it's an echo. What's performed today is an echo of what would have been performed before. Now the gagaku repertoire that's performed today, if you ask those troupes, they say this is exactly the same. It's been transmitted and we are performing it precisely that same way. But there have been periods of interruption. That's the problem, is that the traditional way that materials are passed down, when you have an entire house of people who are then brought up and trained so that you can have a very consistent transmission lineage, that hasn't been the case for gagaku. So there have been periods of interruption. So we really can't presume that what's performed today is exactly the same as before. We do have some pieces of music, music notation. I don't believe any of them directly tied to the 8th century, but not long after, I don't think. I'm not positive on this. So I think that there is certainly similarities. And we can see, especially in China, trying to look at the Togaku, the Tang period music, and try to look backwards and see what that tells us about Tang period music. And so going back and forth, I think that can help expand our knowledge of what this might have looked like at the time. But I think we also have to remember that there's the process of interpretation of what materials they have, of who's heard this music. Are these troupes being brought from China to Japan, or are these kinship groups that have remembered these performances? We really don't know how this is being transmitted exactly. At least I don't know yet. So I don't think it's exactly the same, but I think it has echoes and aspects that are the same. And then the second question about the musical instruments. Some of the more notable examples of instruments belong to Emperor Shomu. And so these are just part of his personal collection. There are really incredible examples. There's a zither from it has a date of like 733, and I always wonder if like maybe that was brought over by the monks who arrived in 735, or at least that diplomatic mission. There's also my favorite piece, which is a 5-string lute. And this is the only example of a 5-string lute we have in the world, except that there is a painting in Dunhuang of a flying aspara playing a 5-string lute. And it's stunningly beautiful. It's covered with mother of pearl. And there's an image of a Sogdian musician playing a 5-string lute on a camel with a palm tree behind him. And just how much information is transmitted just in the visuality of this lute is just astonishing to me. But beyond that, there are records. I don't know if we still have the exact instruments that were used in the opening ceremony, but we do have records of instruments that were there, notably when people borrowed them and didn't return them. That's kind of how we get the records of what's missing more than what is preserved. But again, the pieces that were potentially given these marvelous gifts by the temples may have been these instruments as well. But at least I think some of them would have belonged to Tōdaiji and perhaps used, I think, during this time, but I'm not positive. I think they were. I think certainly ones that were used were put in the shosoin. I'm not positive if ones that remain in the shosoin were used in the eye-opening ceremony.
Thank you very much. Any other question from the floor? Yes, Monica, please.
One thing you mentioned, because the Buddha was destroyed a few times, I think the name is from the other period. With these other eye-opening ceremonies, did they always kind of copy the original ceremony? Were they in the same scale or slightly smaller? Do we have records about the following eye-opening ceremony?
We have records of at least some, and I don't look at the later ones as much because I focus so much on the 8th century, but actually that really big passage from the Tōdaiji Yoroku from 1241, that was added in 1241, I should say, that's actually a 2-part passage. And the first part is looking at the 8th century one, and then the second one is from about a century later when the head falls off because of an earthquake. And so it's not nearly as big. And I don't believe any later ones are to any degree as big as that first one, because that first one is also just consecrating the temple as well as the Buddha himself. But it still is an important process. And there's more than one brush that has the phrasing used for eye opening in the shosoin. There's another one that's really beautiful. It's lacquered, black lacquer, and I'm wondering if that's reflecting a later period.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Ed Clemens here in the chat. Hello. In your eye-opening slide, you interpreted the painting in of the eyes as an opening of the statue to the spirit/presence of the deity, which results in its transformation from statue to icon. Is there support for this interpretation in scripture or other texts? Doesn't this also bring the image to life so that it can see the world and the sufferings of its sentient beings whom it will save?
I haven't looked too much into well, first of all, thank you for the question. I haven't looked too much into the roots of the eye-opening itself, although when I gave a talk at Bristol a few weeks ago, somebody there was an Indian Buddhist scholar, and she said that this is how the eye-opening ceremony functions in India. So this seems to potentially be a practice and a view of understanding this enlivenment that has transmitted with Buddhism and with these Buddhist images. So my understanding is that this is part of the process, because if the statues need to be worked on, there's a process of kind of taking the spirit out too. So it's the sacralization, desacralization aspect of it. Doesn't this also bring the image to life so that it can see the world and the sufferings of its sentient beings whom it will save? I think absolutely. But actually having that statue being able to see is kind of part of the point of this Chakravartin mentality of welcome to my world. in my own backyard, where I have built temples related to my children that Shomu was putting forward of, look at my access to different forms of global performances. But we'll start with the Japanese ones. We'll start with the courtly dances, and then I'll show you my access to other parts of the world. Because this is a Vairottana Buddha. This is the Buddha that's at the heart of the Flower Garland Sutra, which is this very cosmologically intense and very, very large text as well. So I think that the different angles of understanding the opening and the access, the benevolent perspective, but also the kind of self-serving perspective and part of this sense of being this internationally connected Buddhist nation. I think that those go hand in hand.
Excellent, thank you. There's also a follow-up from Ed. Also, how reliable are the labels or other inscriptions that identify Shosoin artifacts as those made for or used in the eye-opening ceremony? As you have said, the antiquity of the storehouse supports claims of authenticity. Have scholars given opinions about that? Could the enduring prestige of the event have led to attributions that are a kind of wishful thinking?
Mm-hmm. I think, and this is why I've tried to use wording. I think this is a very important point where I say that it's recorded as being part of this. Because I completely agree that it's a really important event. And if you find a coiled silk rope, well, surely this is the coiled silk rope that was used for the eye-opening ceremony. So I think that's completely accurate, that we have to be careful with our wording. And so I'll try to say things like attributed to, recorded as, being this way. But at the very least, I think if it's period appropriate, it gives us insight into what this might have looked like. So yeah, we can't, just because there are physical items that correspond with parts of the text, we can't necessarily assume that this is the physical item, but it might be, and it might give us insight into what that could have looked like. So I agree. But
excellent. And one final comment also from Ed. One more comment. You cited Nihon Shoki, 8th century, and Tōdaiji Yoroku, 13th century, as key sources for accounts of the eye-opening ceremony. I would point out that Taminori Samboe, the Three Treasures, dated 984, makes several mentions of the ceremony that, unlike the Nihon Shoki, makes mention of the international participants, including Bodhisena.
Thank you. I've used aspects of the Samboe in my research, but I haven't actually directly engaged with it. So thank you. That is something that I need to look into more. There are images associated where we see depictions of Bodhisena, I think, connected with Samboe. And notably, he does not look like a caricature of an Indian monk. He just looks like a monk. All of the monks look like monks. So you don't actually get that kind of country-based caricature in that portrayal.
There is one from Paulina Colota who's a bit urgent. That's why I take it first. Thanks so much, Abigail, for a great talk. I have to dash for a train, but I had a little bit of general question about historical imagination and ambiguity. What does embracing ambiguity do for our understanding of pre-modern history in that moment, in that specific part of the world? And what does it allow us to imagine about this emerging worldview as knowledge moves across different routes of transition through material and immaterial means?
Great question. And I think the point that I make about the ambiguity is because I think that there can be a tendency to categorize everything, because categories are really nice and convenient and easy. But I think that the example with Butetsu is really great, showing us the limitations of trying to get things too precise when we have no reason to assume that they were precise at this time. Another good example is Bodhisena's origins. There's nothing in 8th century material that I have found that directly says where he came from. Later materials say that he came from Kapilavastu in northern India. And then by contrast, Indian scholarship on Bodhisena really embraced his title as being an Indian Brahmin monk from South India, to insist that he's coming from the southern part of modern day India. Whereas none of the Japanese texts support that view that I have seen. So when we I think embrace the ambiguity. It forces us out of the convenience of the categories. And exactly as Gammons was noting, saying that we have to be really careful about what we rely on when it comes to the things that are very convenient, and open up that, perhaps it wasn't important to know exactly what angle of India Bodhisattva came from, because frankly, we don't even know that he came from India. We just know that that's part of his history. And so that becomes its own truth over time, that in the literary aspect. So I think that's why keeping a certain degree of how did they know this, did they know this, how do we know this, can be really important for understanding that period, but also getting us out of modern day perspectives of these borders.
Thank you. Any more questions from the room? Yes, please, over there.
About whether it could be that the otherness, the form, the link back to the identity of Buddha as Indian, and basically at this point of time, how is that Buddhism already in Japan?
So if I'm understanding, there are kind of two parts here. The first is the importance of the otherness in relation to the Buddha himself in Japan, and then also how established is Buddhism in Japan at this time. So as mentioned at the beginning, Buddhism was formally introduced 200 years ago, according to the Nihon Shoki. There's another text that says 538. And then, of course, there were Buddhists in Japan well before this official transmission period. So again, we have to be careful with what our texts tell us there. But Buddhism has been there for a very long time. It's really in this 8th century that we see a close connection between Buddhism and the state, where we see the rulers not just using Buddhism for certain ceremonies or certain interests, but really intertwining it with the well-being of the state. And if we look closely at the family that was in power, Emperor Shomu, he has a great deal of insecurity surrounding him. He's got poor health. He does not have a living male child by his preferred consort. He does have a living male child by another consort, but who's not part of his maternal family line. He's part of the Fujiwaras. This is the first time we see the Fujiwaras infiltrating the imperial line. But that's also very controversial because they are not liked. We see him and his Fujiwara empress and their remaining child, later Empress Koken and Empress Shotoku, fleeing the capital for 5 years, trying to establish other capitals. But the interest in this reliance on Buddhism remains consistent throughout that. And it's also what he's hearing about that's happening outside in China and Korea as well. And the theme with Buddhism at this time, there's a very pragmatic aspect of protection. The Buddhism that's very popular at this time, it's called state protection, Buddhism in scholarship. But if you do the right ceremony with the right text in the right way, you'll get the entire panoply of Buddhist gods coming to protect you. And they can protect you from famine. They can protect you from pestilence. They can also protect you from uprisings and invasion. And we see at this period in particular the emergence or the importance of an apocryphal text, the Humane King Sutra or Benevolent King Sutra, which says, right, and not only can I turn an invading army away if you do this ceremony, but I'll take that army and I'll send it into another country that's not performing that ceremony. So now it's a threat. And you do not want to be out of sync with your neighbors who are your trading partners, but also very much could turn around and invade you. Japan was afraid of invasion from Shilla, Korea, and from Tang, China. So I tell my students to think of Buddhism as kind of a missile defense system at this time, where we see state temples all around Japan connected to the theme of protection, but protection of the emperor and the imperial family first and foremost. So sorry, tangent. So that is Buddhism established at this time. Could you remind me of the second part of your question? Oh, yes. And so the exoticism aspect, thank you. I think that there may also be a sense of, again, as was being reported, of what the Tang capitals are looking like, that this very international aspect, that this may have just been how these kinds of ceremonies were thought to be performed. We actually see a similar level of performance, not quite as over the top, when the Japanese god Hachiman comes to visit a few years before this. So there's always starting to be a sense of like these like performative aspects are part of state state ceremonies, but I think also there's a sense of, well, this is what he's familiar with. This is we want to make him feel at home, but we also want him to see that we can do exactly what our neighbors are seeing. That's my interpretation.
Thank you. There's one more here, yes, please, and there's two more online. Then we'll...
In the text, there is mention of other foreign ambassadors or diplomats, just sort of linking to your last point sort of about state relations. You think if there was any mention that they were brought back to China or Korea to try and improve Japan's relations with these countries?
So the question is about if the text mentioned any foreign ambassadors or diplomats to Japan. We do have some indication of that, namely from Korea. Now, Korea at this time, in the 7th century, there were 3 kingdoms, but they all got taken over by Shilla. But there was also another state that broke off, and that was called Parhe. And so Japan had diplomatic relations with both Shilla and Parhe. And we do see references, especially to people from Parhe coming. In fact, it's possible that others were invited to come to this eye-opening ceremony because the Shoko Nihongi mentions 1 month later that a prince from Parhe comes to visit. And so the general interpretation is that he came for this, but he got held up in customs, basically, because we have the Zaifu at this time, the customs and immigration, where any visitors would basically have to stay until they got approval from the court that they could go up. And this could easily take a month. And so that's possibly what happens there. So maybe there were others coming to see this. And that is one of the major theories out there, that this is meant to, in kind of a theater of state aspect, both impress the local peoples, but also impress foreign observers. But I don't know of any other ambassadors or diplomats possibly on hand to see this.
Right, thank you. We'll take 2 more and then come back to Anne in the room. So Lisa Kaczynski writes, thank you for this fascinating talk. I know you said that little is known about Butetsu, but are there records of other monks or envoys traveling from Champa to Japan in the Nara or Heian period? It would be very interesting to know to what extent ideas of Indian or Khmer kingship and Tantra traditions were transmitted to Japan.
Great question. To my knowledge, no, there's no other record of anybody from Southeast Asia coming up. That said, there are 2 very interesting pagodas that date to Nara period Japan that look nothing like pagodas. One is the Dotto, and the other is escaping my mind, but one is very, very close to Tōdaiji and the other is in Osaka. But these have almost a ziggurat shape to them. And the one very close to Tōdaiji, it's not very big, but its shape is thought to be kind of reminiscent of Borobudur in is that Indonesia? Mine is blanking. Which was built in a very, very similar time period. And so we're not saying that there are direct connections, but it is thought that possibly there's a similar source of influence, maybe from Southeast Asia. But to my knowledge, there just hasn't been a lot of research. I've only found like 1 or 2 articles about that in Japanese. There's interest, but not a lot of scholarship. So that's the closest I could say about that.
Thank you. And then last one online from Clara Kiko-Brisse. Thank you for this fascinating talk. I was just wondering if the main goal of the valorization of the exotic elements during the ceremony was not to show how that Japan was a part, an essential part of the known world at that time. That is the Buddhist world.
No, I completely agree. I think that this is like, I refer to this in my thesis as kind of like Japan's emergence as this cosmopolitan nation, showing that they're as much a part of the known world of East Asia, and that they're not just this cultural backwater. Because that's very much how Japan is being portrayed in Chinese works. There's a wonderful article that analyzes poetry by Abe no Nakamaro, who went to China for multiple years. He ended up never going back to Japan. He became very, very popular there. And actually, well, this answers Lisa's question. He became the Chinese ambassador to Vietnam, basically. So there's a direct connection, except he never went back to Japan. But there was a point where he thought he was going to go back, and he and his friends composed poetry about how horrible this was and how completely cut off from anything culturally interesting he was going to be for the rest of his life. So that was a portrayal of Japan, and I think that there is a certain degree of concern and trying to fight back against that and saying like, no, look at these, look at these, the access and the knowledge and the kind of possession that we have of these foreign cultures, and that this is intrinsically tied to saying we are part of this world, we're an equal member of this cosmopolitan Buddhist globe.
Right. Thank you. Final question from the floor, Alan.
And a great risk of driving us from the serious to the ridiculous. I wanted to ask about that final piece of the reconstruction that you showed. I think the masks I've seen from Shoshoing and Koryuji have been of the kind of type that you showed. This kind of wooden.
Those are the
In the video, we had something quite different, which were those kind of massive papier-mâché headpieces, which create a very, very specific sense of otherness. They do something quite specific in performance, that kind of I was just really curious, where have those come from? Is there anything like that in those collections?
So the question is, the video clip that I showed with Gigaku has the masks look different from the masks that we see in the Shosoin and Horyuji collections, and that might be emphasizing a sense of otherness. I had exactly the same thought. And so I kept watching that video when I first found the clip, and they go through and they show how they're made. They're still carved from wood. And they're using some mask as a basis. So I've not seen those types of very bulbous Charlie Brown style masks in museums at all. But that little documentary clip was saying that they were basing it off of some mask, or I'm not sure. Maybe when they're painted up and smoothed over, maybe they look a little bit more like that. But yeah, I had this very similar reaction to you when I saw that.
Thank you very much. Right, that brings us to the end of today's talk. Thank you very much for a very engaging presentation. Thank you very much also for joining us online. This is the last event before the winter break. We'll take an extended winter break until the 22nd of January, where Arthur Mitsuki will talk about Japanese migrant communities in Thailand. So please do join us for that. Have a nice break, and hope to see you soon. All the best.